I caught my aunt changing Grandpa's will on his last day. I knew something was wrong the moment I heard Vivian's voice through the gap in the bedroom door. There was a softness to it that didn't belong there, a careful sweetness she only used when she wanted something. I had learned to read my aunt the way storm chasers read the sky, watching for the small signs that something dangerous was coming. And standing in that dim hallway with the smell of antiseptic and dying roses filling my lungs, every instinct I had was screaming at me to open that door. "You already signed it, Harold, don't make this harder." I pushed the door open. Vivian sat beside Grandpa's bed with a neat stack of papers balanced on her knees like she was reading him a bedtime story. Her back was straight, her silver hair pinned perfectly, her face arranged into an expression of patient devotion. Grandpa's hand, thin and trembling and spotted with age, was dragging weakly across the bottom of a page while Vivian's fingers curled around his wrist, guiding him the way you'd guide a child learning to write. The bedside lamp cast a yellow glow over both of them, and for one disorienting second the scene almost looked tender. Then I saw the documents. "That's not the same document," I said. The room went completely still. Vivian's hands stopped moving. Grandpa's cloudy eyes lifted toward me, and what I saw in them wasn't relief, it was panic. That look broke something in my chest. I crossed the room in 3 steps and snatched the top page before Vivian could react. My eyes moved fast down the columns of legal language, and the words blurred together until they didn't, until I understood exactly what I was reading. The original will, the one Grandpa had spent months carefully arranging, the one that divided his estate equally among the family, had been replaced. Nearly everything now flowed into Vivian-controlled trusts. Her name appeared over and over like a signature carved into stone. "You shouldn't sneak into rooms," Vivian said calmly, as if I had interrupted nothing more serious than a quiet conversation. "Grandpa," I said, ignoring her, keeping my voice as level as I could manage even though my hands were shaking. "Did you read this? Did you actually read what you just signed?" His lips moved. "I thought she said it was the same." "You thought wrong because she lied to you." My voice came out harder than I meant it to. Vivian stood slowly, smoothing the front of her blouse with one hand. "Be very careful what accusations you make in a dying man's room, Alina. Give me those papers." "They've been signed." "Give me those papers right now." She pulled them against her chest. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You've never been here, Alina. You never stayed. You flew in 2 weeks ago and suddenly you're the expert on what Harold wants." That hit me somewhere sore. She wasn't entirely wrong about my absence, and she knew it, and she used it the way she used every sharp thing she knew about people. I had spent most of my 20s keeping distance from this family, from the arguments and the money talk and the weight of Grandpa's slow decline. I had told myself I was protecting my own sanity. Vivian had stayed. She had organized his medications and driven him to appointments and answered his calls at 3 in the morning. I had told myself that was her choice. Standing in that room, I felt the guilt of it like a physical weight. But I pushed it down. I was good at pushing things down. "My name is Alina Vale. I am 31 years old and I have spent most of my life being told I am too intense, too suspicious, too unable to let anything go. My memory for slights is practically encyclopedic. I remember every broken promise, every shifted dollar, every small cruelty dressed up as kindness. Grandpa used to call it a gift. Most other people called it exhausting. The truth is somewhere in between. I notice things that other people miss, but I also sometimes find betrayal in places where there isn't any, and I hold grudges long past the point where holding them does any good. I am not always easy to love, and I know that about myself, even if knowing it has never quite helped me change it." Vivian was the opposite of me in almost every way. She had spent nearly 6 decades perfecting the art of being liked. She was elegant and calm and always slightly martyred, always the one who had sacrificed more and worked harder and cared longer. People believed her automatically. Even I had believed her once, a long time ago, before I started paying attention to the gap between what she said and what she did. Then Grandpa started coughing. It wasn't a small cough. His whole body shook with it, his thin shoulders heaving, his face going a terrible gray color. I moved toward him instinctively, reaching for his hand, and he gripped my fingers hard, harder than I expected, his eyes wide and frightened. Blood appeared on the blanket, not a lot, but enough. I looked up at Vivian and she was already stepping back, tucking the papers under her arm, her face rearranged into concern. She leaned close to my ear, her voice was barely a breath. "If you ruin this for me, I'll tell everyone you manipulated him first. You think anyone will believe you over me, you just got here." Then she walked out of the room to call the nurse. I sat beside Grandpa and held his hand while the coughing slowly stopped. He looked at me with those cloudy eyes and I could see him trying to say something, but the words wouldn't come out right. They hadn't for weeks. The illness had taken so much from him already, but his eyes still had that old sharpness in them sometimes, that specific look that meant he understood more than he could express. I squeezed his fingers and told him not to try to talk, that I was there, that everything was going to be fine. It was the first lie I had told him in years. Mila, the hospice nurse, arrived within minutes. She was calm and efficient in the way that people become when they've seen enough suffering to stop being afraid of it, and she gently moved me to the side while she checked his vitals and adjusted his oxygen. She was young, only 27, but there was a steadiness to her that made her seem older. I had liked her from the first time we met. She had a way of watching things without making you feel watched. "He needs rest," she told me quietly, not looking up from his chart. "I need 5 more minutes with him." She hesitated, then she nodded and stepped out, pulling the door almost closed behind her. I bent close to Grandpa. "Did she pressure you? Did she tell you the papers were the same ones you already agreed to?" His eyes moved. "Yes. I'm going to fix this," I said. "I promise you I'm going to fix this." His hand tightened on mine one more time. Grandpa died 3 hours later, just before 2 in the morning, with the rain coming down hard against the windows and Vivian seated on his other side holding his other hand. I was in the hallway. Mila had asked me to step out when his breathing changed. I stood against the wall and listened to the sound of the rain and the low murmur of Vivian's voice through the door, and I did not cry. I couldn't. There was something locked so tight in my chest that tears couldn't reach it. Before I left the bedroom that night, before the argument started and the relatives arrived and the house filled up with grief and politics, I took something. On the small table beside Grandpa's bed there was a plain ballpoint pen, unremarkable, the kind you'd find in any drawer. Grandpa had started using dictation pens during his illness, recording his thoughts when his hands were too unsteady to write. The family knew he had a collection of them. What the family didn't know, what I hadn't even been certain of until I turned it over in my fingers in the dark hallway, was that this particular pen had a tiny recording device built into it. The kind that captured sound automatically when it detected voices nearby. I slipped it into my pocket and walked out of the house into the rain. By morning, Vivian controlled the narrative. The speed of it was something to witness. She cried beautifully at the funeral. She held trembling relatives with practiced grace, pressing her cheek against theirs, murmuring the right things. She spoke at the service about sacrifice and devotion and the long faithful years she had given to caring for a man who deserved nothing less. Every word was technically true. Every word was also carefully arranged to build a wall between herself and consequences. And in the margins of her grief performance she planted seeds. She mentioned just gently to just the right people that Alina had always been volatile, that Alina struggled with money, that Alina had shown up at the end hopping for something. She said it sadly, sympathetically, the way you'd describe a troubled child. Connor believed her immediately. Of course he did. My older brother had always found it easier to accept whatever version of reality required the least amount of uncomfortable action. He was 35 and financially reckless in the way that comfortable people sometimes are, spending freely on the assumption that something would always catch him. He had been counting on the inheritance since before Grandpa was even sick. The idea that it might be complicated, that there might be wrongdoing requiring him to take a side, was genuinely upsetting to him. "You've always had a problem with her," he told me 3 days after the funeral, standing in the kitchen of Grandpa's house with a coffee mug in his hand and the look of someone who had already decided. "Now there's money involved and suddenly you're making accusations." "I'm not making accusations, Connor, I have proof." "What proof? You think you heard something, you think you saw something." "I know what I saw." "Alina." He set down the mug and looked at me with that particular exhausted patience that older siblings sometimes weaponize. "You see betrayal everywhere, you always have. Remember when you were convinced Mom was stealing from Grandpa's account? Remember when you accused Dad's business partner of fraud? You were wrong both times." "I was right about the business partner," I said. "It just took 2 more years for anyone else to notice." He picked up his mug again. "I hope you hear yourself." I spent 2 sleepless nights in the guest bedroom with the pen held up to my laptop's microphone, running the audio through every free enhancement program I could find online. Most of what came out was static and the mechanical sound of breathing and the wet percussion of Grandpa's cough. I sat in the dark with headphones pressed hard against my ears and listened to hours of it, pausing and rewinding, pausing and rewinding. My eyes burned, my neck ached. I told myself I was doing this for Grandpa, and that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that I wanted Vivian to suffer specifically. I wanted her humiliated. I wanted everyone who had believed her to have to stand there and watch her get taken apart. I have enough self-awareness to admit that. Justice and vengeance were tangled together inside me the way they usually are when the wound is personal. Then on the second night I heard it. The static cleared for approximately 45 seconds, and Vivian's voice came through clean and unmistakable. Just sign this version, the others don't deserve it. A pause, the scratch of a pen. There, that's done, that's all it needed. I sat very still for a long time. Then I started making phone calls. I contacted 3 board members from Grandpa's Architectural Foundation, people he had worked with for decades who respected his legacy and who had no particular love for Vivian's recent involvement in foundation decisions. I didn't tell them everything at once. I was strategic about it, which was not natural for me. My instinct was always to dump everything on the table immediately and let the explosion happen. Instead, I asked careful questions, let them fill in gaps themselves, steered conversations toward topics I already knew would lead them somewhere useful. One of them, a retired contractor named George Whitfield, told me without any prompting from me that he had noticed irregularities in the foundation's reimbursement records over the past 18 months. Vivian had been submitting expense claims for caretaking costs that far exceeded anything reasonable. He had flagged it internally and been told not to worry about it. He had been waiting for someone to care. I found Daniel Reese, the family attorney, eating lunch alone at a cafe near his office. He was a nervous man, soft-spoken, with the permanent expression of someone who expected to be blamed for something. He confirmed what I already suspected, that Vivian had contacted him separately from Grandpa, that she had presented the altered documents as a revision Harold had requested, and that he had not independently verified this with Harold before the signing. His voice got quieter and quieter as he talked. By the end, he was barely audible. "Did you know it wasn't what Grandpa wanted?" I asked him. "I had concerns," he said. "That's not an answer, Daniel." "I had significant concerns," he said, not meeting my eyes. I pushed him harder than I should have. I called him twice more that week, once at 9 in the evening, and I said things that were pointed and not entirely fair. I implied that his career could be affected by how he chose to handle this. I was not wrong exactly, but I was more aggressive about it than was necessary, and at one point he told me he was very close to refusing to cooperate at all just because of the way I was speaking to him. I had to apologize, which felt like chewing glass, but I did it. I also made a mistake with Connor. I told him about the recording before I had fully decided how to use it. I wanted him to understand, or maybe I wanted him to feel bad for doubting me, which is not the same thing. He didn't react the way I hoped. He got very quiet and then said he wanted to hear it himself, and when I played it for him, his face went through several expressions before settling on something complicated that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite belief. "That could be taken out of context," he said. "There is no context in which that sentence is innocent, Connor. I'm just saying." She guided his hand. He didn't know what he was signing. She told him it was the same document. That is fraud. She spent years taking care of him. That doesn't give her the right to steal from us. He stood up and left the room, and for 3 days he stopped answering my calls. I should have been more patient with him. I knew how his mind worked. He needed time to rearrange his understanding of things before he could accept a new version of events. But patience has never been my strong suit, and every hour that passed felt like Vivian was getting further away from accountability. Mila found me in the kitchen at 11 at night, going through a box of Grandpa's financial records with a highlighter. She made tea without asking and set a mug beside me and sat down across the table. "How long has it been since you slept a real night?" she asked. "I'm fine, Elena. I'm sleeping enough." "You've lost weight since the funeral, I can see it." She wrapped her hands around her own mug and looked at me steadily. "You started this wanting to protect what your grandfather built, but you don't want justice anymore, you want punishment." I didn't answer. "There's a difference," she said. "Justice is about making something right. Punishment is about making someone hurt. One of those things will give you peace eventually, the other one won't." She guided his hand, Mila, while he was dying. She leaned over him and moved his hand like he was a puppet. "I know what she did." Her voice was quiet but firm. "I saw things in that room, not just that night, over the weeks before he died. He told me he was afraid of signing things. He was afraid of being alone with certain people." She paused. "I should have reported it sooner." "Will you say that? If it comes to it, will you say it officially?" She looked at her tea for a moment, then she looked at me. "Yes," she said. "But Alina, you need to be careful about how far you're willing to go, because there's a version of this where you get the outcome you want and lose yourself in the process." I told her I understood. I'm not sure I did, not really, not at that point. Then Daniel called. His voice was tight with something between fear and urgency. "She's moving forward with the transfer," he said. "The paperwork is scheduled to be finalized in 48 hours. Once it goes through probate with those signatures, challenging it becomes significantly more expensive and more complicated. You need to act now or you need to walk away. I'm not walking away. Alina, if you're going to present that recording, you need to do it in a controlled setting with witnesses. You can't just confront her privately. She'll deny everything and get ahead of the story. I know how to handle Vivian. I don't think you do, he said. I say that with respect. I think you know how to fight her. I don't think you know how to beat her. I gripped the phone tighter. Then help me do it right. There was a long silence. The will reading is the day after tomorrow, the full family gathering at the house. If you're going to expose this, that's the moment. Can you stall the transfer until then? I can find reasons to need one more day. Administrative delays, it's not unusual. Then do it. Another silence. Alina, if this goes wrong, I want you to know that I'm prepared to come forward about my own role in this. I should have pushed back harder when she presented those documents. I let myself be pressured, that's on me. I didn't expect that. It softened something in me slightly. Thank you, Daniel. Don't thank me yet, he said, just don't make it a circus. The night before the will reading, I barely slept at all. I lay in Grandpa's guest room and stared at the ceiling and went through every possible version of how the next day could unfold. The house was quiet in the way that empty houses are never quite quiet, full of the small sounds of an old building settling into itself. I thought about Grandpa. I thought about the night he died, the way his hand had tightened on mine, the look in his eyes. I thought about whether what I was about to do would have made him proud or whether it would have made him sad. The truth was I didn't know. He had been a complicated man. He loved this family even as he watched money work its poison on it. He had told me once years ago that the worst thing his success had done was give his children something to compete over. He said it almost like an apology. I had been 22 and hadn't fully understood what he meant. I was beginning to understand it now. The morning of the reading was gray and wet. A thunderstorm had been threatening since dawn, and by 11 it was making good on the promise, rain hammering the windows and occasional lightning turning the sky an ugly green-white. The family gathered in Grandpa's old library, the room that still smelled like him, like wood polish and old paper and the particular dry warmth of many accumulated books. Relatives filled the chairs and stood against the walls. Connor arrived and wouldn't look at me. Several cousins and a great-uncle sat together on one side of the room. Daniel stood near the fireplace with his briefcase, looking like a man who had not slept either. Vivian arrived last. She came through the door in black silk, her hair perfect, her posture the posture of someone who had already won and was simply here to accept the result gracefully. She looked around the room with a small, composed smile, acknowledging people with nods, taking her seat at the center of the room as if it had been reserved for her. Then her eyes found me across the library and her smile changed very slightly. It became careful. Alina, she said, just loudly enough for the room to hear, still chasing ghosts. I didn't say anything. Daniel opened his briefcase. He cleared his throat and began reading. The altered will unfolded clause by clause into the listening room. As the meaning became clear, faces changed. A cousin leaned over and whispered to the person beside her. The great-uncle's eyebrows rose steadily. Connor's jaw tight. The relatives who had been told nothing specific about any dispute were starting to understand that the document being read was not what most of them had expected. Murmuring began and Daniel kept reading over it, his voice getting slightly louder and slightly faster, like a man trying to outrun a rising tide. Then I pressed play. The recording came out of my phone speaker into the quiet room, and Vivian's voice filled the space between the bookshelves and the storm gray windows. Just sign this version, the others don't deserve it. The silence that followed was not brief, it stretched and stretched. Someone made a sound that was half gasp and half something else. Connor went completely still. I watched Vivian's face drain of color for the first time since I had known her, the careful composure running out of it like water, leaving something underneath that was older and harder and frightened. Then she recovered. She was remarkable that way. That recording has been edited, she said. Her voice was steady, but only just. Alina has been building a case against me for weeks. She is clearly capable of manipulating audio to support a narrative she's constructed out of grief and resentment. It hasn't been edited, I said. I have the original pen, I have the device, I can have it forensically authenticated today. You are not well, Alina. Everyone in this family knows you struggle. Daniel, I turned to him, tell them what you told me. Daniel's face was the color of old paper. He set down his documents and pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at the room. I have concerns, he said, about the process by which the amended will was presented for signing. I was not given adequate opportunity to independently confirm the principal's full understanding of the changes. What does that mean? The great uncle asked sharply. It means, Daniel said carefully, that the signing may not have met the standard required for a valid testamentary document. The room erupted, multiple people speaking at once, chairs scraping, voices rising. Vivian stood. You have no idea what you're accusing me of, her voice cut through the room. I was here for years, where were the rest of you? Vivian, I said. No, she turned on me fully, and the composure was gone now. And what was underneath it was something rower and angrier than I had expected, something that had been compressed for a very long time. You want to stand there and act like you cared about him. You visited twice a year, twice. I changed his sheets. I sat with him at 4 in the morning when he was frightened. I reorganized my entire life around keeping him comfortable while all of you got to just live yours. Nobody in the room said anything. Because the terrible thing, the thing I had not fully prepared myself for, was that she wasn't wrong. Not about that part, she had been there. The sacrifices she had made were real. The resentment she had built up over years of watching a family collect the benefits of her labor while she did the actual unglamorous work of caregiving, that resentment was earned. I understood it standing there. I had seen it in other families. The person who stays becomes convinced that staying is a form of ownership. No one is saying you didn't sacrifice, I said. My voice came out quieter than I intended. But sacrificing for someone doesn't give you the right to steal from them. You think you get to decide what I deserve. I think Grandpa got to decide that, and you took that away from him. He was confused and frightened and you used that, I said. You waited until he couldn't fight back. Mila, Connor's voice came from behind me, and I turned to see that he had turned toward the hospice nurse who had arrived quietly at some point and was standing near the doorway. Did you see anything at the end? Mila's face was calm and very serious. Mr. Vale expressed concerns to me on multiple occasions about signing documents. He asked me specifically to be present when documents were presented to him. That request was not honored on the night in question. He also expressed confusion to me about what he had signed in the days before he died. Vivian turned on her. You have no standing to speak here. You were his nurse, not his confidant. He told me things, Mila said simply. People tell their nurses things they don't tell their families. He told me he was scared. He told me he wasn't sure what he had agreed to. He told me he wanted to fix it, but he didn't have the strength. She paused. I should have acted on that information sooner. I'm sorry I didn't. The sound Vivian made was not quite a scream. It was something that had been building for a very long time, finally pushing through the surface. You think any of you cared about him? She shouted, and her voice shook with it, all the years of it, the actual grief mixed up with the actual wrong. You think sitting here now and playing these recordings means you cared? I watched him disappear piece by piece, and I was alone in that, and none of you have any right to judge what I did when I had given everything. You forged his trust, Vivian, I said. I earned it. You forged the legal document. That is fraud. That is a crime. Everything I did was for this family. No, I said, it wasn't, and somewhere inside yourself you know that. There was a knock at the library door, sharp and official sounding. Then it opened. 2 police officers stood in the frame, rain-damp, professional, unhurried. They asked for Vivian by name. She looked at them, she looked at me. For one moment her face held something that I could not name, something that was almost recognition, almost the beginning of something real. You did this, she said to me quietly. Daniel did this, I said. He reported it this morning. You made him. I didn't answer that because I wasn't sure I hadn't. The officers were patient and quiet, and they spoke to her in low voices and guided her toward the door. She walked with her back straight and her chin up, still performing composure even now, still holding the posture of someone who had not lost. She said my name once more as she reached the doorway, just my name, nothing else. Then she was gone. The library held its silence for a long time after that. Rain against the windows, the smell of old books. Connor sat down heavily in the nearest chair and put his head in his hands. The relatives spoke among themselves in hushed tones. Daniel closed his briefcase and began making phone calls to other lawyers. Mila caught my eye from across the room and gave me a look that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite approval and wasn't quite the opposite of either. I had done it. I stood in the middle of that room and I had done exactly what I set out to do, and I waited for the feeling I had been chasing for weeks. What I felt instead was very tired. The legal process that followed took months. The family inheritance was frozen while the courts reviewed the circumstances of the signing and the authenticity of the recording and Vivian's history with the foundation finances. The forged reimbursements George Whitfield had flagged became part of a separate financial misconduct investigation. Daniel cooperated fully, acknowledging his own failure to properly supervise the signing process, and in doing so probably protected himself from more serious professional consequences while contributing significantly to the case against Vivian. She hired 2 attorneys. The process was expensive and exhausting and ugly in the way that family legal matters always are, because the facts of a family's worst moments are laid out in documents in conference rooms, and no one looks good in that light. Connor stopped speaking to me for 4 months, not because he believed Vivian was innocent. I think he eventually accepted that she wasn't, but because confronting the truth about what she had done also meant confronting his own willingness to believe her version of events, and that was uncomfortable in a way he hadn't been prepared for. When he finally called me, late on a Tuesday evening, he didn't apologize exactly. He said he was glad I had the recording and he was sorry he hadn't listened sooner, and then he talked about something else and we let that be what it was. Vivian was charged with document fraud and financial misconduct. The trial took 6 months. She was ultimately convicted on 2 counts, with a sentence that included restitution and community service and no prison time, which some people in the family felt was insufficient and others felt was adequate, and I spent a long time not knowing what I felt about it. She looked older at the sentencing than she had at the will reading. She did not look at me. The house went to me. The original will, reconstructed from earlier drafts with the court's guidance, restored the equal distribution Grandpa had intended, with various specific bequests honored where they could be verified. The house, which Grandpa had apparently specified separately in an earlier document predating the illness, came to me specifically. I moved into it in early winter when the trees in the yard were bare and the rooms echoed. I spent the first 2 weeks just living in it quietly, learning its sounds, figuring out which floorboards creaked and where the morning light fell. 3 weeks after I moved in, I was sorting through Grandpa's desk, the old oak one in the corner of his study that smelled like decades of paperwork and pipe tobacco he had given up 20 years before I was born. I had been avoiding it. Going through a dead person's desk is its own particular kind of grief, all the small evidence of a daily life that no longer exists. I found reading glasses, 3 pairs. I found a folder of old architectural sketches. I found receipts and letters and a broken watch and a small photograph of my grandmother that I sat with for a long time. In the back of the bottom drawer, tucked under a manila envelope of insurance documents, there was a sealed white envelope. My full name was written on it in Grandpa's handwriting. Not his recent handwriting, the shaky, uncertain letters of his last months, but his older writing, firm and precise and distinctly his. Whoever had given it to me would have had to go out of their way to make sure I found it and not someone else. I turned it over in my hands several times before I opened it. The note inside was short, 2 paragraphs written on plain white paper, undated. I knew Vivian was planning to change the will. I had known for some time. I have not been as confused as people believed. I want you to understand that. I let it proceed because I wanted to see what my family would do when money gave them a real reason to hate each other. I wanted to see who you would become. That is not something a good person does, and I am not asking you to forgive me for it. I am only asking you to understand that I was watching and that I saw you choose something harder than silence, and that I am proud of you even knowing that your reasons were not entirely pure. None of our reasons ever are. The house is yours, not because you fought for it, because you have always known what to do with the things you love. I read the letter twice without moving. Then I sat for a long time in Grandpa's chair in the corner of the study, the old leather one that had always smelled like him, and I looked out the window at the bare winter yard and the sky going gray with evening, and I thought about everything the letter meant. He had known. He had sat in that bed and allowed it to happen and watched me discover it, and he had made it a test, which was either the most profound thing a person had ever done for me or the most manipulative thing a parent figure had ever done to a family, and I was not sure which one it was. Maybe it was both. Maybe that was the point. He had spent his whole life building something and watching money transform the people around him, and at the end he had done one last thing that was neither entirely kind nor entirely unkind, and he had left me to figure out what to make of it. What I kept coming back to was his line about reasons not being pure. He was right about that. I had told myself throughout all of it that I was doing this for him, for justice, for the family, and those things were true, but so was the other thing. I had wanted Vivian to be humiliated specifically. I had wanted to be the one holding the evidence that took her apart. I had pushed too hard at Daniel and been too rough with Connor, and I had driven myself half out of my mind in a spare bedroom with headphones and a pen and weeks of sleeplessness. I had let the revenge feel good in ways that made me less proud when I looked at them clearly. Justice had happened. Vivian had been held accountable. The fraud had been exposed and the estate was being handled properly, and Grandpa's actual wishes were being honored as closely as possible. Those were real outcomes that mattered. and the way I had pursued them, the places where my obsession and my pride and my capacity for deep enjoyment of other people's comeuppance had shone through, those things had not been irrelevant. They had been part of the picture too. Mila had told me the difference between justice and punishment. Grandpa, in his letter, had told me something slightly different. He had told me that the difference didn't matter as much as whether I was willing to see myself clearly when it was over. I sat in his chair in the darkening study and I tried to do that, to see myself clearly, to hold the whole thing at once, the part of me that had been brave and the part that had been vengeful and the part that had genuinely loved him and the part that had wanted to win. It was uncomfortable the way that honest self-examination always is, but it felt like something real. Outside the window, the yard held its winter stillness. Inside the house, the floors creaked their old, familiar language. The desk with his handwriting on the envelope sat 3 feet away from me and would sit there for as long as the house stood. He had left me the house. And somewhere in the leaving of it, in the letter tucked in the back of the drawer, he had left me something else too. Not a verdict, not an answer. Just the question sitting quietly in the room with me, waiting to see what I would decide to do with it. I reached over and turned on the desk lamp. I had some things to think through.